At a bustling auction, a frail and sickly horse stood unnoticed, scorned by everyone as worthless. No one spared him a second glance, except for one determined woman who saw what no one else dared to imagine. She took him home, and what happened next would leave those who rejected him utterly stunned. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, its harsh glare reflecting off the dusty planks of the stockyard fences. The auction was in full swing, a lively parade of horses brought in from ranches scattered across the region. Buyers, clad in wide-brimmed hats and polished leather boots, strode purposefully between the pens, their eyes sharp as they assessed each animal. Some jotted notes in pocket-sized notebooks, while others spoke in low tones, gesturing at the horses they hoped to claim. The air buzzed with the hum of conversation, mingled with the restless whinnies of horses and the clanking of chains. Whenever one of the prized horses entered the exhibition area, the noise dwindled, replaced by an electric tension as all eyes fixed on the creature. "Look at that coat," one man murmured. "Powerful legs on that one," another chimed in. Yet, in a quiet corner of the yard, away from the bustling activity, stood a pen so overlooked it might as well have been invisible. Inside, a gaunt horse stood motionless, its head hung low, its dull coat caked in dust. Its ribs protruded sharply, and its frail legs seemed barely capable of supporting its weight. Most men passed by without so much as a glance, though a few snickered under their breath. "That one's a lost cause," a man said dismissively, shaking his head. "Wouldn't even pull a cart. Probably brought here out of pity," another added with a cruel laugh. "Better off sent straight to the slaughterhouse." The horse remained unmoving, its sunken eyes showing no fear, only a quiet resignation, as though it had long since grown used to being ignored, unseen, and unloved. Through the crowd, a young woman made her way forward with steady determination. Grace, her chestnut hair tied in a practical braid, wore a simple white shirt smudged with dirt, faded jeans, and scuffed riding boots that had seen better days. Slung over her shoulder was a small leather pouch holding her savings, hard-earned from long hours on her family's ranch. Her sharp, clear eyes scanned the horses on display, lingering on the most magnificent ones, yet none held her interest for long. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. "Never judge a horse by its appearance. Look deeper, beyond what the eyes can see." As she wandered toward the forgotten corner, her steps slowed. Her gaze fell on the neglected horse, and something about its stillness, its quiet acceptance of being overlooked, stirred something deep within her. She approached the pen, paying no attention to the sneering remarks of nearby onlookers. "What are you doing here, boy?" she murmured softly, resting her hands on the rough wooden fence. The horse barely lifted its head, just enough for their eyes to meet. For a moment, a strange weight settled in Grace's chest. What she saw in those eyes wasn't merely sadness. It was something deeper, a mix of resignation and a faint, buried longing to be noticed. "What's caught your eye about that bag of bones?" an older man asked, his voice tinged with mockery as he stepped closer. "That's none of your concern," Grace replied firmly, her gaze never wavering from the horse. Slowly, she reached out a hand. The horse stiffened at first, but then, sensing no threat in her gentle gesture, it inched its nose toward her fingers. The touch was fleeting, but it was enough. Enough for Grace to make up her mind. When the auctioneer announced the horse, his voice lacked the enthusiasm he'd shown for the others. It was almost apologetic. "Well, folks, here we have a young horse in need of some care. Maybe someone can find a use for him." The crowd fell silent. Not a single hand went up. Quiet chuckles rippled through the yard as a few heads turned away, dismissing the very idea of bidding. "I'll take him," Grace said, her voice cutting through the stillness. The declaration landed like a thunderclap, drawing startled stares and incredulous laughter. "You've got to be kidding," a man scoffed. "What are you going to do with that animal? He's nothing but trouble." Grace ignored the whispers and mocking glances as she walked straight to the auctioneer. "What's the price?" she asked firmly. The man looked at her with surprise, as though the idea of someone wanting the horse was incomprehensible. "Not much," he replied, shrugging. "Pay the minimum and it's yours." Without hesitation, Grace handed over the bills, her hands steady despite the laughter and murmurs surrounding her. "Sold," the auctioneer announced with evident relief, closing the deal. Taking hold of the horse's lead rope, she turned to him and spoke softly. "From now on, I'll call you Blaze," she said, gently running her hand along the horse's muzzle. "Mr. Worry Boy, no one's going to reject you again." As they walked away from the chaotic auction, the voices of skeptics trailed after her. "That girl has no idea what she's doing. She's going to regret it." Grace didn't glance back. Walking beside Blaze, she felt a mix of uncertainty and determination swirling within her. She didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. She had seen something in this horse that others hadn't, and she wasn't about to give up. For hours, Grace and Blaze traveled along a dusty trail that wound its way to her family's ranch. Each step seemed to test Blaze's strength, his legs trembling as though they were about to give out. Worried, Grace stopped several times to let him rest. Every glance at the worn-out horse only strengthened her resolve. "Take it easy, boy," she whispered soothingly, stroking his sweat-drenched neck. "We're almost there. I promise you'll never go through anything like this again." The path was solitary, bordered by fields of dry grass and wind-stirred shrubs. Her body was weary, but her mind churned with thoughts of what she'd done. She knew she'd taken a huge gamble. Most of her savings had gone into a horse that everyone else dismissed as worthless. The ridicule at the auction echoed in her mind. Those skeptical murmurs, the disbelief in their eyes, the outright derision. He's a lost cause. But there was something about Blaze she couldn't ignore. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, or a deeper, inexplicable sense that their paths were meant to cross. Grace had always believed that, like people, horses had their own essence, and sometimes what seemed broken just needed someone to believe in it. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was sinking behind the hills, painting the landscape in hues of gold and orange. Her home stood ahead, a modest but welcoming wooden structure with a small stable and a corral nearby. On the porch, her grandfather Henry sat sharpening an old tool. His hair was white, his hands weathered by years of hard labor. When he saw Grace approaching with Blaze, he set the tool aside and narrowed his eyes, watching in silence. Finally he stood, resting his hands on his knees. "What's with the horse?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and concern. "He's mine, Grandpa," Grace said as she stopped in front of the house. Her words were confident, but there was a faint note of nervousness in her voice. She knew Henry wasn't one to pass quick judgment, but he never shied away from speaking hard truths. Henry walked over slowly, scrutinizing the horse with a practiced eye. He circled Blaze, examining his legs, coat, and posture. The horse barely lifted his head, utterly drained from the journey. "Skin and bones," Henry muttered, shaking his head. "Looks like he hasn't had a decent meal in months." Grace pressed her lips together, but held his gaze. "I know, Grandpa, but I think he can recover. He just needs time, care, and someone to believe in him. Henry raised an eyebrow, folding his arms across his chest. Time and care? Do you even know what you're saying, girl? A horse in this state doesn't just need food and rest. It's going to take a lot of work. And even then, you can't always count on them bouncing back. I'm willing to try, Grace said without hesitation. For a moment, Henry studied her in silence. Then, with a faint sigh, he nodded. Well, if you're so sure, go ahead. But he's your responsibility. You'll feed him, train him, and prove he's worth the effort. A warm smile spread across Grace's face, gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you, Grandpa, she said softly. Thanks, Grandpa. I won't let you down. Henry pointed toward the stable. Put him in the small paddock for now. Tomorrow we'll figure something out. Grace led Blaze to the corral, where she had hurriedly prepared a makeshift shelter for him. Untying the rope that held him, she let him roam free. The horse didn't move right away. Instead, he turned his head, his deep, dark eyes locking onto Grace's face as though trying to decipher what was happening. She crouched down, pulling out a bucket of fresh water she had prepared earlier and placed it before him. Here you go, boy. You've earned this. Blaze drank eagerly, his tense body loosening with each gulp. Afterward, Grace brought him some hay, sitting cross-legged on the ground to watch him eat. It was only then that she noticed how thin he truly was, his ribs sharply visible beneath his dull coat. But there was something else, something the others had overlooked. Despite his frailty, the way Blaze held his head high and scanned his surroundings spoke of a quiet resilience that had not been extinguished. When her grandfather returned later to check on them, he found Grace fast asleep against the fence, her body curled up at its base. Blaze stood nearby, his ears tilted slightly forward as if standing guard over her rest. Henry allowed himself a small, knowing smile. Maybe you're right about him, girl, he murmured softly before turning back toward the house. That night, under a canopy of stars, a bond of trust and hope began to form between Grace and Blaze. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but what they shared, an unshakable belief in what they could become together, was stronger than any doubt or derision from others. The first few weeks at the ranch were far more demanding than Grace had imagined. Blaze arrived in such a pitiful state that each day became a battle, not just to rebuild his strength, but to earn his trust. Though he now had ample food and water, at first he hardly touched his meals, as though he'd grown accustomed to scarcity. Grace's mornings started early. She would inspect the hay, carefully mixing in supplements to ensure he regained the nutrients he desperately needed. Often, she'd spend hours sitting beside him, her voice low and soothing as she spoke. Blaze would watch her with wary curiosity, his eyes flickering between hesitation and intrigue. Take it easy, boy. You're not in competition anymore. This is your time, and we're going to make the most of it, she reassured him. The first real test came just days later. One morning, Grace decided to take Blaze to the main paddock, hoping the open space would encourage him to stretch his legs. But as she gently tugged the lead rope toward the gate, Blaze froze. His entire body went rigid, and his eyes brimmed with a terror Grace had never seen before. It's okay. Easy now, she murmured, holding the rope firmly but without pulling. She knew forcing him would only deepen his fear. From the fence, Henry watched silently, leaning on the walking stick he used to navigate the ranch. After a long moment, he spoke. That horse is broken inside, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of experience. It wasn't a harsh judgment, but a simple truth stated plainly. His eyes don't lie. Someone hurt him, and now he thinks every step might lead to a trap. Then we'll fix him, Grandpa, Grace replied, her gaze never leaving Blaze. "But we'll do it his way, not ours." That day, she didn't push him any further. Instead, Grace sat down on the ground near the gate, letting the rope slacken in the dirt. Blaze stood still, watching her, tense and unyielding at first. But as the hours passed, the tension in his frame began to ease. The only sounds were the rustling of the wind and the occasional chirping of birds, a peaceful rhythm that seemed to calm them both. The next day, they tried again, and the day after that. Each hesitant step Blaze took toward the paddock became a small victory for Grace. Though progress came slowly, she celebrated every moment as though it were a grand achievement. When, at last, Blaze crossed the threshold of the gate, a swell of emotion rose in Grace's chest. She smiled, her voice warm and soft as she stroked his neck. "I knew you could do it," she said. Building Blaze's physical strength proved just as challenging. Barely strong enough to trot, he tired quickly during their sessions. Grace crafted a careful routine, introducing him to gradual exercises designed to rebuild his endurance over time. In the beginning, Grace simply guided Blaze around the corral, leading him with patience and care. She gradually introduced short bursts of running, always mindful not to push him too hard. There were days when progress seemed tangible, and others when fatigue or his lingering insecurities caused setbacks. Yet, there was something about Blaze that captivated Grace, a glimmer of determination that refused to be extinguished. Despite his frailty, Blaze never fully gave up. Just when it seemed like he had reached his limit, he would summon the strength to take another step forward. Henry, though skeptical at first, eventually became part of the process. He watched Grace work with Blaze, offering bits of advice from his wealth of experience. "Mr. Rush him. A horse needs strength not only in his body, but in his mind. If he trusts you, he'll do things no one thought possible." One afternoon, as Grace worked with Blaze in the corral, Henry approached carrying an old wooden brush. "Need a hand with this?" he asked, extending it toward her. She smiled and accepted it. As Grace stroked Blaze's back, Henry began brushing his neck with steady, deliberate motions. At first, the horse tensed, his muscles rigid beneath the touch of the unfamiliar hand. But slowly he relaxed, the careful rhythm soothing him. "It's funny," Henry said after a while. "This horse reminds me of one I had when I was young. Just as stubborn, just as wary. But once I earned his trust, there wasn't a more loyal horse in the world." Grace looked at him curiously. "What happened to him?" Henry's face softened into a wistful smile. "He became the best horse I ever had, but that was because I gave him time. Never rush a horse, Grace. They'll teach you patience, and if you listen to them, they'll give back more than you could ever imagine." That evening, as Grace sat by the corral watching Blaze, her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. She was certain Blaze had something special, something no one else had noticed. Over the months that followed, her care transformed him. His once thin, fragile frame grew strong and muscular. His dark coat, which had lost its luster, began to shine again. His movements became fluid, graceful, and confident. But what struck Grace most was the change in his eyes. Where once there had been fear and resignation, there was now a spark of trust and determination. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but every moment spent with Blaze reinforced her belief that she had made the right choice at that auction. The challenges were many, but her heart was certain. Blaze was destined for greatness. As Blaze's progress became undeniable, Grace braced herself for the ultimate test. One afternoon, while she was leading him through the corral, Henry appeared with a rope and an old saddle that had been stored away in the barn for years. "It's time for this boy to know what it feels like to carry a rider," he said, a mix of pride and challenge in his tone. Grace glanced at Blaze, who stood calmly, his ears flicking lazily as he grazed. Though they had come so far, riding him would be a delicate step. Any mistake could undo the hard-earned trust between them. "Do you think he's ready?" she asked, stroking Blaze's neck with a tenderness born of months of care. "We won't know until we try," her grandfather replied, resting the saddle on a nearby fence. "But if anyone can do it, it's you. He trusts you." That night, Grace stayed awake longer than usual, her thoughts swirling with plans and anticipation. From the moment she bought Blaze, she had dreamed of entering him in equestrian competitions, not for the glory, but to prove that a horse's origin didn't define its potential. Still, she knew better than to rush the process. At sunrise the next morning, Grace brought Blaze to the corral. The saddle waited in a corner, and she approached the task with the same deliberate care that had guided their journey so far. First, she let him sniff and examine the saddle, giving him time to grow familiar with it. Then, with gentle, steady movements, she placed it on his back without fastening it. Blaze stiffened, craning his neck to inspect the unfamiliar weight on his body. Grace calmed him with soft words, her hand gliding along his flank until he relaxed once more. It was a slow, deliberate process, but each small step strengthened their bond. When the saddle was finally secured, Henry stepped into the corral. "All right, girl. Let's see how he handles it when you're up there." Grace nodded, but didn't mount immediately. Instead, she walked alongside Blaze, guiding him around the corral with the saddle already secured. The horse stumbled a few times, his movements awkward and uncertain, but gradually he began to adjust to the unfamiliar weight on his back. Finally, Grace took a deep breath and positioned herself beside the horse. "All right, boy, let's give this a try," she murmured. With careful, deliberate movements, she placed her foot in the stirrup and hoisted herself up, settling into the saddle. Blaze froze instantly, his muscles tensing as though unsure of what to do. Grace remained calm, sitting still and giving him time to adapt. "That's it, boy. You're doing great," she said softly, leaning forward to stroke his neck. Blaze let out a long sigh, and slowly he began to move. His steps were tentative at first, but with each lap around the corral, his confidence seemed to grow. Grace felt a surge of pride and relief as she noticed the horse not only tolerated her presence, but was beginning to move naturally beneath her weight. From his spot by the fence, Henry watched with a satisfied expression. "See what I told you? He wasn't broken. He just needed someone to remind him what he's capable of." That day marked a turning point for both horse and rider. Now that Blaze had accepted the saddle, the next challenge was training him for competitions. Grace understood that show jumping and dressage demanded discipline and precision, but more importantly, an unshakable bond between rider and horse. Weeks later, it was time to venture beyond the ranch and expose Blaze to new environments. Grace decided to take him to the nearby open fields where he could get used to different terrains and unfamiliar sounds. The first outing was chaotic. The rustling wind through the trees and the crackling branches unsettled him, and at one point he bolted, almost throwing her off. "It's okay," Grace said firmly, holding the reins steady but without pulling. "I've got you." Despite the setbacks, they persevered. Day by day, Blaze grew more confident, learning to trust not only Grace, but also his own instincts. Their connection deepened, becoming unmistakable to anyone who saw them together. From a distance, Henry often watched with a smile tugging at his lips. "That horse doesn't just have strength," he remarked to a visiting friend one day. "He's got heart, and that's all thanks to Grace." The breakthrough came one afternoon while they practiced basic jumps on a small course Grace had set up. The initial attempts were clumsy, with Blaze knocking over the rails more often than not, but with patience and repetition, he began to synchronize his movements. When he finally cleared a jump cleanly, Grace let out a jubilant cheer, throwing her arms around his neck. "You did it, boy. I knew you could." That night, as she sat on the porch gazing at the stars, Grace couldn't help but dream about the future. They were still a long way from major competitions, but for the first time since buying Blaze, she felt he was ready to face the world. The journey hadn't been easy, but they were proving that the past didn't have to dictate the future, and that with enough determination and faith, any obstacle could be overcome. For months, Grace and Blaze trained tirelessly, conquering every challenge that arose. They had started with the basics, but now Blaze leapt gracefully over higher obstacles, executing precise maneuvers that showcased the unique bond between them. Yet for Grace, the true test lay ahead, stepping into the competitive world. One morning, as she reviewed the schedule of local equestrian events, Henry approached with a mug of coffee in hand. "Well, have you decided yet?" Grace sighed, setting the calendar down on the table. "There's a competition in town next month," she admitted. "But I'm not sure we're ready. There's still so much to work on." Henry gave her a steady look. "Listen, kid, nobody starts out perfect. If you keep waiting for the ideal moment, it'll never come. Blaze is ready, and so are you. The only thing left is for you to believe it." Bolstered by her grandfather's words, Grace signed up for the local event. It was a small competition meant for beginners, but even so, it was a significant step forward. The thought of competing in front of a crowd of spectators and seasoned riders sent a wave of nerves through Grace. The day of the competition arrived faster than she expected. Grace meticulously prepared Blaze, brushing his coat until it gleamed like polished obsidian under the warm sunlight. She adjusted the saddle with care, making sure everything was just right. "Ready, boy?" she asked softly, locking eyes with him. Blaze responded with a gentle nicker, almost as if he understood the gravity of the moment. When they reached the arena, the energy of the bustling crowd and the constant motion of horses and riders unsettled Blaze. He shifted restlessly, tossing his head and snorting at every new sight or sound. Grace stayed composed, guiding him with steady hands and a calming voice. "Easy now," she murmured, stroking his neck. "We're in this together." As her turn approached, Grace couldn't ignore the glances cast her way. Some curious, others skeptical. Many in the crowd recognized the once scrawny and awkward horse from the auction, though he was nearly unrecognizable now. "Isn't that the horse no one wanted to bid on?" a man muttered near the rail. "Yeah, but it looks like they've cleaned him up," another replied, laughing. "Not that it'll make much of a difference." Grace bit back a sharp retort, focusing instead on the faith she had in Blaze. He was so much more than they realized. When her name was finally called, adrenaline surged through her veins. With practiced ease, she mounted Blaze and guided him into the arena. The course was straightforward, but demanded precision and trust. She took a steadying breath, adjusted the reins, and gave Blaze the signal. He started with a measured trot that quickly transitioned into a fluid gallop. The first obstacle, a low bar, was cleared effortlessly. A taller jump came next. Blaze hesitated for a split second but then surged forward, clearing it with a powerful leap that left the crowd hushed in surprise. Every jump and turn was a testament to their hard work. Though not flawless, their synchronicity was undeniable. For Grace, it wasn't about winning. It was about proving what they'd achieved together. As they crossed the finish line, the arena erupted in applause. Not everyone understood the full extent of their accomplishment, but many saw the dedication and effort it represented. Grace leaned down from the saddle, wrapping her arms around Blaze, her heart swelling with relief, pride, and gratitude. In the resting area, a few competitors came by to congratulate her. One of them, a young man named Jake, studied Blaze with a mix of surprise and admiration. "Is this the same horse I saw at the auction a few months back?" he asked. Grace nodded, running her hand along Blaze's neck. "It is. His name is Blaze, and he's far more than anyone gave him credit for." Jake smiled, clearly impressed. "You've done something amazing. That horse has a spark, and so do you." When the results were announced, Grace wasn't expecting to place, but to her astonishment, they were awarded third place. As she accepted the medal, a quiet realization settled over her. This journey had become more than proving Blaze's worth. It was about embracing the bond they'd built and the challenges they'd overcome. That evening, as they returned to the ranch, her grandfather, Henry, was waiting on the porch. His expression was a mix of pride and tenderness. "I knew you could do it, Nina," he said, "but this is just the beginning." Grace smiled, glancing at Blaze. "I know, Grandpa, but I'm ready for whatever's next." And so is Blaze. With their first competition behind them, the road ahead was clearer than ever, promising new goals and challenges. In the days that followed, a wave of emotions washed over Grace and Blaze. The pride of their accomplishment lingered, but so did the weight of newfound attention they hadn't anticipated. One morning, as she fed Blaze in the barn, Henry appeared, holding a letter in his hand. "It's for you, baby," he said, with a knowing look. "Seems like someone was impressed." Grace wiped her hands on her apron before opening the envelope. Inside, she found an invitation to participate in a regional jumping and dressage competition, far more prestigious than the local event she had entered before. Attached was a personal note from the event organizer. "We admire your dedication and the undeniable bond you share with your horse. We believe Blaze has remarkable potential, and it would be an honor to have you both among the participants." Grace smiled, though a flicker of nervousness crept into her chest. Competing at such a high level meant going head-to-head with the best, but it was also an opportunity to showcase Blaze's worth. "What do you think, Grandpa?" she asked, holding out the letter. Henry studied it carefully before nodding. "I think this is the next step for you, but be prepared," he added, his voice steady but firm. "The higher you climb, the more critical the eyes watching you will be." With that, their training intensified. This time, Grace hired an experienced trainer to help them refine their technique. Mike, the trainer, was a no-nonsense man, but his fairness and keen eye quickly earned Grace's trust. It didn't take him long to notice something extraordinary about Blaze. "This horse has heart," he remarked one afternoon, watching Blaze soar over a jump. "But he also has a wild spirit, something rare. Just make sure he never loses the trust he has in you. That's what makes him exceptional." The day of the regional event arrived sooner than Grace expected. The venue was intimidating, with grandstands packed with spectators and riders astride impeccably groomed horses. Despite the charged atmosphere, Blaze seemed more assured than in previous competitions. His stance was solid, his ears forward, attuned to Grace's every movement. As they warmed up, Grace noticed a group of men watching them from afar. At first, she ignored them, but soon she recognized one of the men. It was the auctioneer who had sold her Blaze months ago. "That's the horse nobody wanted, right?" one of the men asked, his tone a mix of astonishment and admiration. "Yeah, but it seems the girl saw something the rest of us missed," another replied. Look what she's done with him." Grace pretended not to hear them, focusing instead on her preparations. But just before she entered the arena, one of the men approached her. He was stocky, with a self-assured air that bordered on arrogance. "Excuse me, miss," he began, his tone casual but confident. "My name is Daniel. I was at the auction where you bought this horse. I'll admit I never imagined he'd come this far. What you've achieved is impressive." Grace nodded curtly, keeping her guard up. Daniel pressed on. "In fact, I'd like to make you an offer. I'm prepared to buy this horse from you for a substantial sum. What do you say?" Lifting her chin, Grace met his gaze directly. "He's not for sale. Blaze isn't just a horse to me. He's my partner." Daniel smirked as if he hadn't heard her. "I can offer you more money than you'd ever win at these competitions. Think about what you could accomplish with a new horse, one with a stronger pedigree." Grace tightened her grip on Blaze's reins, feeling him tense slightly beneath her touch, as though he understood the exchange. "No matter how much you offer, you can't buy what we've built together. Blaze stays with me." Daniel raised an eyebrow, then shrugged. "Suit yourself, but remember my words. A horse like that shouldn't go to waste." Grace watched him walk away, a mix of pride and indignation swelling within her. She was keenly aware of the many eyes on them, some filled with admiration, others eagerly anticipating their failure. But she refused to let it rattle her. When their turn came, Grace and Blaze entered the arena with unwavering resolve. The jumps were higher, and the course was more challenging than anything they had faced before. Yet, Grace's faith in her horse never faltered. With every leap and every turn, they proved they were not only up to the task, but capable of excelling beyond expectations. The bond between them was almost tangible, drawing gasps from the crowd. When the final round ended, the audience erupted into applause. Though they didn't claim first place, finishing second in their first regional competition was an incredible achievement. But for Grace, the true victory wasn't the silver trophy. It was the undeniable proof that she and Blaze were an unbreakable team. That evening, as Grace rode back to the ranch, her mind churned with thoughts of what had transpired. She understood that success would inevitably draw more attention, and with it, new challenges. Yet, no matter how many offers or criticisms came their way, one truth remained unshakable. Blaze was far more than just a horse. He was her partner, her friend, and together they were ready to face whatever lay ahead. What had started as a personal dream was now evolving into an extraordinary journey, with each competition deepening the bond they shared. Their connection was the cornerstone of their success. Every event brought new lessons and reminded Grace just how far they had come since that day at the auction, when Blaze had been overlooked by everyone. But fame was a double-edged sword. After their win at the regional event, word of the rejected horse-turned-champion began to spread through equestrian circles. Some found their story inspiring, while others viewed it with skepticism. One afternoon, as Grace was training in the corral, a sleek black car pulled up to the ranch's entrance, its polished surface starkly out of place amidst the rustic surroundings. From it stepped a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit, his sharp appearance a striking contrast to the dusty ranch. "Grace Martinez?" he asked, his tone firm yet smooth. Grace dismounted Blaze, curiosity sparking in her eyes as she approached the fence. "That's me. How can I help you?" "My name is Ethan Chambers," the man replied, producing a business card from his jacket pocket. "I represent one of the most prestigious horse breeding establishments in the country. He extended the card toward her. "I've been following your progress in the competitions, and I must say I'm impressed. Your horse, Blaze, is truly exceptional." Grace accepted the card, though her expression remained cautious. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "We've worked hard to get where we are." "That much is clear," Chambers replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Which is exactly why I'm here. My client is very interested in acquiring Blaze. He's prepared to offer you a substantial sum, more than any prize you could win in a competition." Grace's chest tightened. The offer wasn't unlike the one she'd received after the regional event, but this time it came wrapped in a professionalism that only added to her discomfort. "He's not for sale," she said firmly, her hand instinctively resting on Blaze's neck. Chambers seemed unfazed. "I understand your attachment," he said, his voice laced with the patience of someone used to negotiating. "But I urge you to consider what you could achieve with that money. You could purchase a horse with an impeccable pedigree, one that could elevate you to the pinnacle of this sport." Grace stepped forward, positioning herself between Chambers and Blaze as though shielding her companion from the man's words. "Mr. Chambers, I don't think you understand what this horse means to me. He's not just a tool for competition. He's my friend, my partner. Everything we've accomplished, we've done together. No amount of money could ever replace that." For a moment, Chambers studied her, his expression unreadable. Then he shrugged, a faint note of condescension in his voice as he said, "It's a pity, but let me make one thing clear. In this world, emotions don't take you far. Greatness comes at a cost, and one day you'll have to decide if you're willing to pay it." With those parting words, he turned and strode back to his car. Grace watched him drive away, anger and determination burning hot in her chest. That evening, as she mucked out the stables, she recounted the encounter to Henry, who listened quietly, leaning on the shovel he'd been using to help her. "Men like that always show up when they see something that shines," he said at last, his voice calm but firm. "But the real question, Grace, is why you're on this path. If it's glory you're after, they might sway you someday. But if it's something more, then no offer will ever make you waver." Grace pondered his words as her gaze drifted to Blaze, resting peacefully in his stall. Her expression softened as memories surfaced, memories of a time when the world had turned its back on him. Together they had defied the odds, and no price could ever measure up to what they had built. "I'm not in this for the trophies, Grandpa," Grace finally said, her voice steady. "I'm here because I want to prove that courage isn't about what others think, and because Blaze deserves to shine, not for them, but for himself." Henry nodded, a proud smile playing on his face. "Then keep going, girl. But remember, the higher you climb, the harder they'll try to bring you down." Grace knew he was right. With her growing reputation came greater challenges, yet her resolve was unwavering. She was determined to defend everything they had built, no matter the cost. With that in mind, their training intensified, all in preparation for the upcoming National Show Jumping Championship. It wasn't just another event. It was a chance to face not only the best riders in the country, but also the weight of lingering prejudice and skepticism. To Grace, nothing was more gratifying than proving, again and again, that Blaze was far more than just an overlooked horse. He was a champion, both in body and spirit. The day of the National Show Jumping Championship dawned crisp and electric, the air thick with anticipation. To Grace, this wasn't merely a competition, it was a stage to prove that she and Blaze belonged among the elite. The venue was a sight to behold, massive grandstands filled with spectators, the hum of voices mingling with the occasional neigh of a horse. In the warm-up ring, pristine horses and seasoned riders exuded confidence as they prepared. "Ready for this, girl?" Henry asked, his hand firm on Grace's shoulder as they gazed at the course from afar. She took a deep breath and glanced at Blaze. Despite the commotion around them, he stood calm, alert, as though he understood the gravity of the moment. "We're ready, Grandpa. No matter what happens, we'll face it together." The competition was divided into 2 stages, an initial course with medium-height jumps and a second, far more technical round. Only the best would advance, and Grace knew that perfection was her only option. When her number was called, whispers rippled through the crowd. Many had heard of Grace and Blaze, but others remained doubtful. A horse discarded at auction couldn't possibly rival those bred specifically for this sport. Grace mounted with poise, adjusting the reins as she guided Blaze toward the arena. The crowd fell silent as they positioned themselves at the starting line. "Let's do this, boy. It's our moment," she murmured, her hand grazing Blaze's neck in encouragement. The whistle blew, and Blaze launched forward in a smooth gallop. The first challenge was a towering triple jump. With effortless power, Blaze cleared it, drawing scattered applause from the stands. Obstacle after obstacle fell behind them as the pair displayed a seamless blend of skill and determination. Each turn, every jump, was a testament to their relentless training and unshakable bond. When they crossed the finish line without a single fault, the crowd erupted into cheers. Number 47, Grace Martinez and her horse Blaze qualify for the second round with an outstanding time, the announcer declared. Grace exhaled deeply, a grin spreading across her face as she leaned down to pat Blaze. "We did it, boy. We really did it." In the resting area, she felt the weight of mixed gazes from her competitors, some filled with admiration, others with doubt. A few came forward to offer congratulations, while others lingered at a distance, skepticism still etched into their faces. Among those who approached was Jake, a young rider she had met at a regional competition. "I knew you had something special, but that was incredible," he said, his smile genuine. "Thanks, Jake. It's Blaze who deserves the credit," Grace replied modestly, scratching the horse behind his ears. The second round promised to be far more challenging, tight turns, intricate combinations, and imposing obstacles. Grace watched the other riders as they took their turns, each showcasing remarkable skill and precision. When her number was called, she felt the weight of every pair of eyes. Judges, spectators, and competitors alike fixed on her. This time, the pressure was palpable, but she grounded herself in what truly mattered: her connection with Blaze. The second course was a monumental test of their abilities. At the third obstacle, a complex zigzag pattern, Blaze hesitated for a moment, but with Grace's steady guidance, he regained his rhythm and cleared it flawlessly. Grace could feel her heart racing as they approached the final challenge, a towering double jump designed to intimidate even the most seasoned riders. Blaze galloped forward with unwavering determination, and with a powerful leap, they soared through the air, landing gracefully on the other side without grazing a single bar. The crowd erupted in applause. Grace leaned down, whispering words of gratitude to Blaze as the announcer declared their time, the second fastest in the entire competition. When the awards ceremony came, Grace and Blaze stood proudly on the podium to receive their silver medal. Though it wasn't gold to Grace, the achievement held far greater meaning. From the stands, Henry beamed with pride, while Jake clapped enthusiastically among the crowd. Scanning the faces around her, Grace also spotted some familiar ones. Daniel and Chambers watching from afar, their expressions a mix of astonishment and envy. Clutching the medal tightly in her hands, Grace murmured, "This is just the beginning, Blaze. We'll go even further together." That night, back at the ranch, Grace and Henry celebrated quietly, sitting on the porch and gazing at the stars. For Grace, success wasn't measured in trophies or medals, but in the unbreakable bond she shared with Blaze, a connection that no accolade could surpass. Months after the national championship, Grace and Blaze had become prominent names in the equestrian circuit. Their story resonated deeply, inspiring many, especially those who believed in second chances. But with fame came an onslaught of attention, threatening to test everything Grace and Blaze had built together. One crisp morning, as Grace trained at the ranch, Henry came rushing out of the house, his face lined with worry. In his hand, he carried a newspaper. "Grace, you need to see this," he said, handing it to her. She stopped riding and took the paper, her eyes landing on the front page. There was a photo of her and Blaze from their last championship, accompanied by a bold headline, "The rejected horse, the unlikely champion everyone wants to buy." The article recounted their rise in the competitive world, but also detailed Blaze's near dismissal at the auction where no one saw his worth. It described how now breeders and wealthy buyers were offering outrageous sums to acquire him. "They can't be serious," Grace muttered, her irritation mounting. "Believe it," Henry replied gravely. "Ever since that silver medal, everyone's got their eyes on you and Blaze." Before she could respond, a sleek black car pulled up to the ranch entrance. 3 sharply dressed men stepped out, and Grace immediately recognized one of them, Daniel, the man who had tried to buy Blaze at the regional championship. "What do they want now?" Grace whispered under her breath as Henry approached the men. "Stay calm, girl," her grandfather said gently. "Hear them out, but remember who you are and why you do this." Henry opened the gate to let the men in, and Daniel wasted no time getting to the point. "Miss Martinez, we've met before, but today I bring a formal proposal. My client is prepared to offer $5 million for your horse. This includes a contract for you to train at our state-of-the-art facility." Grace crossed her arms, her expression resolute. "I've told you before, Blaze is not for sale. Not for $5 million, not for 10. No amount of money will change my mind." Daniel smirked as though unused to having his offers refused. "Miss Martinez, this isn't just business. It's an opportunity for you. Imagine training other horses, competing on the international stage. Why limit yourself to just one horse?" Grace's blood boiled as she stepped forward, her voice firm. "Do you know what that horse means to me? When everyone else dismissed him, I saw him for who he truly was, a fighter, a champion. Every achievement I've earned has been with him, not because of his pedigree, but because of his heart. And that's something you'll never understand." She gestured toward Blaze, who stood calmly in the corral, his dark eyes watching the exchange as if he, too, understood the weight of the moment. The men exchanged glances, surprised by the firmness of her response. Daniel made one last attempt to sway her. "We understand your emotional attachment, but feelings don't win competitions, miss. Think about it. $5 million. That's more money than you'll ever see in your entire life." Grace took a deep breath, striving to keep her composure. Finally, she lifted her chin and locked eyes with Daniel. "Blaze is priceless. He's my partner, my family, and I will never betray him for money. So, if you're done trying to convince me, I'd appreciate it if you left." Daniel's expression darkened, but he knew he had nothing left to say. Without another word, he and his companions returned to their car and drove off. As the sound of the engine faded into the distance, Henry let out a hearty laugh. "That'll give them something to think about. I doubt they'll bother you again." Grace smiled, though her chest still hummed with adrenaline. She watched as Blaze galloped freely across the paddock, his mane catching the breeze. Walking over to him, she rested her forehead against his and closed her eyes. "I promised to protect you, remember? No matter what happens, we'll always be together." Blaze let out a soft snort, as if he understood every word. That evening, as the sun set over the ranch, Grace sat beside Henry on the porch. "Do you think I made the right decision?" she asked, gazing out at the horizon. The old man adjusted his hat before answering. "The right decision isn't always the easiest or the most lucrative, but if you can go to bed knowing you didn't betray what you love, then yes, you made the right choice." Grace nodded quietly. In her heart, she knew Blaze's true worth wasn't in what others were willing to pay for him, but in everything they had built together. Years passed, but the bond between Grace and Blaze remained unbreakable. Though they didn't win every championship they entered, they achieved something far greater, inspiring others to see potential where no one else could. Blaze became a legend, not just for his victories on the track, but for his story of resilience. Whenever Grace recounted how she had bought him at an auction where no one else saw his value, the faces of those listening lit up with wonder and admiration. One day, after a peaceful morning on the ranch, Henry approached her with an old notebook in his hands. Grace, brushing Blaze under the warm sun, looked at him with curiosity. "What's that, Grandpa?" she asked, setting the brush aside. "It's something you should start writing in," he replied, handing her the notebook. "Your story. And Blaze's. Not to boast, but so others can understand what it means to never give up." Grace opened the notebook and smiled at the blank pages. "Do you really think anyone would want to read it?" Henry looked at her with a proud smile. "Believe me, girl, this story has the power to change lives." Inspired by her grandfather's words, Grace began writing at night while Blaze rested in his stall. She recalled every detail of their journey together, the auction, the grueling training sessions, the championships, and the moments when they nearly gave up. But she also wrote about Blaze's strength, his loyalty, and how he had taught her that the true worth of a champion isn't in their pedigree, but in their heart. When the notebook was filled, Grace decided to publish it as a book titled Blaze, The Story of the Horse Nobody Wanted. The book became a sensation, touching not just horse lovers, but anyone who had ever felt underestimated by the world. Meanwhile, Blaze enjoyed his retirement on the ranch. Though he no longer competed, he still trotted with vigor, played in the paddock, and basked in the love of children who visited to learn about horse care. On one of those visits, a small boy cautiously approached Grace, his steps hesitant, yet filled with curiosity. "Is it true that this is the horse from the book?" he asked, pointing at Blaze, who was grazing peacefully beneath the shade of a large oak tree. "It's him," Grace replied with a warm smile. "And no one wanted him." The boy's wide eyes reflected both wonder and disbelief. Grace nodded and crouched down to meet his gaze. "No one wanted him at first," she said gently, "but he was always special. He just needed someone to believe in him." The boy stared at Blaze with admiration for a moment before rushing over to him, giggling as he ran his small hands over the horse's sleek, soft coat. That evening, as Grace sat on the porch gazing at the stars scattered across the vast sky, Henry, now older and moving with a slower grace, joined her with a contented sigh. "Do you realize what you've accomplished, girl?" he said, his voice carrying both pride and awe. "Blaze didn't just change your life. he changed the lives of so many others. That horse wasn't just a champion, he became a symbol of hope. Grace's gaze drifted toward the corral, where Blaze lay resting under the same brilliant sky. "He taught me everything, Grandpa," she murmured, her voice tinged with emotion. "I don't even know if I saved him or if it was the other way around." Henry chuckled softly, his expression filled with wisdom. "Maybe it was a little bit of both," he said. That night, Grace went to bed with a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing she had kept the promise she made to Blaze from the very beginning, to protect him, care for him, and show the world his true worth. And so, the tale of a horse once rejected at an auction grew into a legend, not just on the racetracks, but in the hearts of everyone who had ever dared to dream of overcoming the impossible. If you've made it to the end of this story, I'd love for you to share your thoughts. Wow, what an incredible story, right? Even though this tale of Grace and Blaze is fictional, it's packed with so many heartfelt lessons that resonate deeply with real life. Stories like this remind us about the power of belief, not just in others but in ourselves. Grace saw something in Blaze that no one else did, and because of her unwavering faith, what seemed impossible became extraordinary. The story also teaches us about resilience. Blaze's journey from being overlooked and discarded to becoming a champion mirrors the struggles so many of us face. Whether it's being underestimated, facing rejection, or feeling like the odds are stacked against us, the message is clear. With patience, hard work, and the right support, we can overcome anything. On a deeper level, this story beautifully highlights the bond between humans and animals. It's not just about care and training, it's about mutual trust, love, and understanding. Blaze wasn't just a horse to Grace, he was her partner, her friend, and together, they created something truly inspiring. But maybe the biggest takeaway here is that value isn't always visible at first glance. So often, we judge others, or ourselves, based on appearances or circumstances. Grace reminds us that everyone and everything has potential waiting to be unlocked. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did this story touch your heart as much as it did mine? What part of the story resonated most with you? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It really helps. Let's keep celebrating the stories that inspire us to dream big and believe in the impossible.